Welcome to the Pharmaphiles, where medicine meets mystery. Hi, I'm Lance Simmert.
Hi, I'm Justine Burke.
So, picture the absolute dead of night in a sprawling, densely packed 19th century city. The year is somewhere in the late 1880s.
Right.
And a heavy, suffocating fog rolls off the river, mingling with the acrid smoke of coal fires that never truly burn out. Inside a cramped, poorly ventilated tenement apartment, the darkness is nearly absolute.
Yeah, save for the dim, erratic, flickering glow of a single oil lamp on a wooden table.
Exactly. That weak light casts long, shifting, almost monstrous shadows against the peeling wallpaper. And in the center of this gloom, a mother is pacing.
Just walking back and forth.
Right. Her feet rhythmically trace the worn floorboards back and forth, back and forth. In her arms is an infant who's been crying for 4 relentless hours.
Which is, that's not merely a fuss.
No, it is a high-pitched, piercing, jagged wail of sheer agony. The kind of sound that, bypasses the ears and vibrates directly within the bones of anyone who hears it.
Oh, absolutely. The physical and emotional toll in that specific, isolated moment is immense. Almost incalculable. The child is caught in the vicious grip of teething.
Yeah.
Her tiny, flushed cheeks are burning bright red, radiating a feverish heat into the cold air of the room. Her fists are balled up so tightly against her chest that her knuckles are entirely white.
And her back arches in spasms of pure distress.
Right, and absolutely nothing the mother attempts is working. The traditional methods have completely failed.
The gentle, rhythmic rocking beside the wooden cradle.
Failed. The soft, desperate lullabies hummed into the dark.
Veiled. Offering warm milk or, pressing cold, damp cloths against those swollen, inflamed, angry gums.
None of it works. The distress remains utterly impervious to maternal affection. The crying continues, unabated, shattering the quiet of the night.
And the most suffocating part of this nightmare is that the crying does not stay contained within the walls in the nursery.
Oh, definitely not.
In a Victorian home, whether it's a sprawling townhouse or a cramped tenement, noise spreads like a physical vapor. It seeps beneath the thin wooden doors.
Travels through the uninsulated floorboards and down the drafty corridor.
Exactly. So in the very next room, separated only by a flimsy partition, a husband is desperately trying to catch a few hours of sleep. He must be awake before the dawn breaks to endure another grueling, physically destroying 12-hour shift at the local textile factory.
Or the ironworks.
Right. You can hear the violent rustling of his blankets as he tosses and turns, muttering in frustration, because his livelihood is genuinely threatened by the lack of rest.
And upstairs, a toddler has been startled awake by the shrieks and is beginning to whimper in the dark.
Meanwhile, outside the frosted window pane, the city is coldly indifferent to their suffering. The heavy metallic rattle of horse-drawn carriages dragging over uneven cobblestones just continues into the night.
The whole world is relentlessly carrying on.
Yeah, demanding participation, and this exhausted mother finds herself trapped in a tiny, suffocating bubble of absolute panic.
She's desperate. She is functioning on the ragged, fraying edge of human endurance at this point.
Absolutely.
The entire household's ability to survive, to wake up, to work, to simply exist the next day is hanging by a single thread. The wailing of the child is not just a sound. It is a profound disruption of the fragile order keeping the family afloat.
Yeah.
And it is in this specific atmosphere of terror and exhaustion that a parent looks for a miracle.
So she reaches for the bottle, she crosses the room, opens a small wooden cabinet, and pulls out a slender glass vial filled with a dark, syrupy liquid.
Brings it close to the flickering oil lamp to read the label.
Right, and makes an incredibly confident, sweeping promise. It declares in elegant typography that it provides immediate, certain relief for, quote, teething, colic, fretfulness, and all diseases to which children are subject.
Wow.
Yeah. So with trembling hands, she carefully pours out a dark spoonful. She gently parts the screaming infant's lips and administers the thick liquid.
And the effect is profound and almost immediate.
The frantic, jagged rhythm of the crying begins to slow. It downshifts into a whimper, then a sigh. You can physically watch the rigid tension bleed out of the baby's tiny body.
Her fists uncurl, her flushed face relaxes.
Yeah, her heavy eyelids begin to droop, fluttering once, twice before closing entirely. And within minutes, the turbulent, chaotic nursery falls completely Blessedly, impossibly silent.
Peace, finally.
Finally.
But, the silence that descended upon that room was not the gentle, restorative quiet of natural sleep.
No.
It was a profound, chemically induced sedation. For millions of parents across the 19th and early 20th centuries, this exact, desperate scene played out night after night.
In cities and farmhouses across the globe.
Exactly. The medicine they were relying upon, the miraculous dark liquid in that glass vial, was known as Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. And the reason it was so extraordinarily effective at silencing screaming children was simple, brutal, and terrifying.
It contained a massive dose of morphine. It's like turning off a screeching fire alarm by cutting the main power line. The noise stops, you finally get peace, but the house is still burning down.
That is a perfect way to put it. To understand how a narcotic of that immense power became the defining pediatric treatment of an entire era, you must first understand the terrifying landscape of 19th century medicine.
Right, because this was the golden age of patent medicines.
Yeah, an era defined by a profound lack of scientific understanding and an abundance of suffering. Conventional medicine at this time was not a source of comfort. It was often a source of sheer terror.
Absolutely.
Physicians of the era operated under deeply flawed paradigms of human anatomy. They relied heavily on the ancient concept of humoral theory, which is the belief that illness was caused by an imbalance of fluids within the body.
So to correct this imbalance, doctors employed treatments that were, by any modern standard, barbaric.
Truly barbaric. If you fell ill, the doctor would not offer a gentle pill. They would initiate a violent assault on your body. Bloodletting remained a standard practice.
Right. Physicians would take a sharp lancet and literally slice open a patient's vein, draining pints of blood into a bowl, believing the sickness would just flow out with it.
And if bleeding wasn't deemed sufficient, they would turn to purging. They'd administer powerful, agonizing emetics and laxatives designed to induce severe, violent vomiting and uncontrollable diarrhea.
Intentionally dehydrating and exhausting the patient.
Yes. Or they utilized blistering, applying harsh, caustic chemical irritants directly to the skin to intentionally create massive, painful, weeping sores.
Because the underlying theory suggested that these artificial wounds would somehow draw the internal sickness to the surface.
Exactly. And perhaps most horrifying of all, they aggressively prescribed calomel, a compound heavily laden with toxic mercury.
Which is just awful. Mercury poisoning would cause the patient's gums to swell, their saliva to pour out in thick streams, and eventually their teeth to literally loosen and fall out of their jaw.
So in that nightmarish medical environment, patients were not merely unhealed, they were actively traumatized by the people supposed to be saving them.
All right, germ theory, the understanding that microscopic bacteria and viruses cause disease, had not yet been accepted. The concept of antibiotics was decades away.
And pediatric medicine was an absolute wasteland. Infant mortality rates were staggering. A devastating percentage of children simply did not survive to their 5th birthday.
Succumbing to dysentery, cholera, diphtheria, or unspecified fevers.
Yes. So it is crucial to recognize the psychology of a parent living in that reality. If your infant is unwell, and your choice is between summoning a doctor who will intentionally bleed your fragile child or cover their delicate skin in blistering agents,
versus purchasing a sweet-tasting, beautifully packaged syrup that promises immediate, gentle, painless relief.
Exactly. The choice is not merely obvious, it is a matter of profound maternal mercy. The patent medicine industry recognized this massive, terrified, desperate void in the medical marketplace, and they rushed in to fill it.
And fill it they did. The newspapers of the 19th century were absolutely saturated with elaborate, sprawling advertisements for thousands of different patent cures.
You could open any daily paper in London or New York and be greeted by spectacular promises.
Yeah, there were tonics claiming to be universal blood purifiers, nerve restorers guaranteed to banish melancholy, remedies targeted at vague, terrifying ailments like female weakness or wasting disease.
They promised to cure tuberculosis, cancer, epilepsy, asthma, and paralysis.
But of course, scientific evidence never factored into these claims. The entire industry was built upon a foundation of unregulated, aggressive commerce. But that begs the question, if these miracle tonics weren't actually healing anyone, why didn't people realize they were being scammed?
Right, that's the core question. And it's because the patent medicine manufacturers understood something incredibly profound about human perception. Sensation is easily mistaken for salvation.
Wow, sensation over salvation.
Exactly. These remedies rarely contained ingredients capable of curing a pathogen, but they leaned heavily upon powerful, active chemical agents that produced immediate, undeniable, and overwhelming physiological effects.
Like alcohol.
Yes, alcohol was utilized as a primary solvent and base in countless mixtures, often at proofs higher than standard whiskey. Cocaine was frequently blended into tonics marketed as energizers and nerve restorers. And opium, alongside its potent derivative morphine, was ubiquitous.
The physiological trick was remarkably effective, wasn't it?
Unbelievably so. Say you were suffering from the agonizing, racking cough of advanced tuberculosis. Your lungs were being destroyed.
Right.
But if you swallowed a thick syrup heavily laced with opium, the drug would flood your central nervous system. It would dramatically depress your body's cough reflex.
And would induce a profound floating sensation of euphoria and numbness.
Exactly. You were still dying of tuberculosis, but the terrifying symptom had vanished, and you felt an immense warm rush of well-being.
Or, if you consumed a tonic loaded with cocaine, the sudden sharp spike in your heart rate and dopamine levels made you feel instantly invigorated, powerful, and cured of your fatigue.
Right. A medicine that rapidly energized you, deeply numbed your pain, or forced you into a heavy slumber felt incredibly effective. The chemistry bypassed the disease entirely and directly altered the patient's perception of reality.
And in this unregulated frontier, manufacturers were under absolutely no legal or moral obligation to disclose their formulas.
None at all.
There were no ingredient lists printed on the back of the bottles. Consumers had no reliable method of discovering that their trusted daily lung tonic was essentially pure liquid opium, or that their infant soothing drops were fundamentally narcotic.
They purchased the promise, they experienced the immediate sensation, and they logically assumed that the rapid change in their physical state was absolute proof of the medicine's healing power.
Right. And this landscape of unregulated chemistry and desperate consumers set the perfect stage for the creation of an empire.
It really did.
In the late 1840s, in Bangor, Maine, two enterprising businessmen named Jeremiah Curtis and Benjamin Perkins launched a product that would completely revolutionize the patent medicine industry.
And keep in mind, they were not doctors. They were not chemists.
No, they were merchants looking for a lucrative opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
To sell their new infant syrup, they realized they needed a narrative.
A very specific, reassuring narrative.
Exactly. And so, they either heavily embellished or entirely fabricated the origin story of the syrup. They claimed the formula belonged to a kindly, deeply experienced old nurse named Mrs. Charlotte Winslow.
And honestly, whether a genuine Charlotte Winslow ever actually existed is largely irrelevant to the history of the product because she functioned entirely as a brilliant, carefully calibrated corporate symbol.
Yeah.
Curtis and Perkins understood that in an era where formal medical authority was deeply associated with pain, bloodletting, and terror, they needed to project the exact opposite image.
Right. The name Mrs. Winslow did not evoke the cold, frightening clinical authority of a surgeon.
No, it evoked profound domestic wisdom. It suggested the safe, warm, ancient knowledge of a grandmother who had spent a lifetime patiently seating beside cradles, nursing countless generations of children through the perilous darkness of sickness.
And the marketing materials surrounding the syrup were just a masterclass in emotional manipulation.
Oh, totally.
The advertisements never featured illustrations of sterile laboratories or serious men in medical coats. Instead, they utilized beautiful, idyllic lithographs.
Right, depicting serene, angelic infants sleeping soundly in lavish cradles.
They showed deeply relieved, beautifully dressed mothers gazing lovingly down at their quiet children. The imagery projected peace, serenity, and the ultimate restoration of household order.
The syrup was framed not as an aggressive medical intervention, but as a pure extension of maternal love and care.
Think of Mrs. Winslow as the 19th century equivalent of today's most trusted mom influencer. She wasn't selling a drug, she was selling the ultimate parenting hack.
That's a great comparison. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated psychological bypass. By leaning entirely upon the imagery of the maternal figure, the company successfully dismantled any natural skepticism a parent might hold toward a mass-produced chemical.
Right, because they felt they weren't purchasing a compound mixed in a factory. They were purchasing the trusted, time-honored advice of a seasoned nurse.
Exactly. And by the latter half of the 19th century, this brilliant strategy had transformed Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup from a regional concoction into a massive, unprecedented international phenomenon.
The reach of the product was staggering. It completely shattered geographic and class boundaries.
Wealthy aristocratic mothers residing in massive, opulent London townhouses kept a bottle on hand, administered by their nannies.
While working-class families, crowded into the soot-stained tenements of New York City, saved their pennies to ensure the bottle was always on the shelf.
Even families braving the brutal, isolated conditions of the American frontier considered it as essential a survival tool as flour or ammunition.
It was sold in pharmacies, grocery stores, and by traveling merchants. It offered a universal, highly prized commodity to every demographic, absolute predictability in a terrifyingly unpredictable world.
But that predictability was achieved through a chemical formulation of staggering danger.
Right. What was actually inside the elegant glass bottle?
Well, the formula was essentially a mixture of sugar syrup, alcohol, and sodium carbonate, heavily fortified with morphine sulfate.
Wow.
Because there was no regulatory body to enforce standardization, the exact potency of the syrup could fluctuate wildly from batch to batch, depending on the supplier and the manufacturing conditions of the day.
But extensive historical and pharmacological analysis suggests that a typical bottle contained concentrations of roughly 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce.
Let us pause and truly absorb the magnitude of that number. 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce.
It's hard to even comprehend. Today, morphine is an extremely tightly controlled substance administered in incredibly precise microscopic increments by trained anesthesiologists, carefully calibrated to the exact body weight of the patient.
Exactly. The idea of freely pouring a liquid containing 65 milligrams of morphine per ounce into a spoon and feeding it directly into the mouth of a fragile 6-month-old infant is almost incomprehensible.
It really is.
To fully grasp the sheer peril of this dosage, we must examine the physiological mechanics of morphine within the human body. Morphine is a powerful opiate that binds specifically to the mu-opioid receptors located throughout the brain and spinal cord.
And its primary function is to drastically suppress activity within the central nervous system.
Right. In an adult human, a carefully controlled dose effectively blocks the transmission of pain signals, induces a deep sense of muscular relaxation, and promotes heavy sedation. But an infant is not merely a small adult.
No.
An infant's central nervous system is highly immature, rapidly developing, and profoundly sensitive to chemical intervention. Furthermore, their body mass is a tiny fraction of an adult's, meaning the drug saturates their system with terrifying speed and intensity.
And the most critical and dangerous effect of this systemic suppression occurs within the brainstem, specifically in the respiratory centers that involuntarily control breathing.
Exactly. Morphine actively blunts the brain's sensitivity to carbon dioxide in the blood.
Normally, when carbon dioxide builds up, your brain urgently signals your lungs to breathe deeper and faster, right?
Right, but morphine severs that vital communication line. As the drug takes hold of the infant, the signals instructing the lungs to expand begin to weaken. The child's breathing becomes progressively shallower.
The respiratory rate drops drastically.
The rhythm becomes erratic, characterized by long, terrifying pauses between breaths. The oxygen levels in the blood begin to plummet. The heart rate slows to a crawl.
And the child slips past sleep and descends into a profound, chemically locked state of unconsciousness.
Yes. And this physiological reality leads to the most chilling paradox of pediatric opiate overdose. When an adult imagines a lethal poisoning, they typically envision dramatic, undeniable symptoms, violent convulsions, foaming at the mouth, agonizing gasps for air.
But a morphine overdose in an infant presents entirely differently, doesn't it?
Entirely. It is silent. It is deeply deceptive. A child suffering from acute respiratory depression simply becomes exceptionally quiet.
They become perfectly still.
Their limbs go entirely limp. They appear to be in a state of impossibly deep, unbreakable slumber. They do not cry out. They do not struggle.
The descent toward death looks almost exactly like the deep, peaceful rest that an exhausted parent so desperately desires.
Exactly. The very symptoms of grave, life-threatening medical danger, the profound stillness, the unresponsiveness, the slow, shallow breaths, were universally interpreted by these terrified, sleep-deprived parents as absolute, undeniable proof that the miraculous syrup was working perfectly.
It was the ultimate tragic confirmation bias. You want your baby to sleep, the drug delivers a near coma, and you praise the medicine because the silence arrives so quickly.
Exactly. The medicine's effectiveness was self-evident to them. The horrific screaming that had tormented the house for hours had ceased instantly. The child was finally resting.
The desperately needed calm had been restored to the household.
For an overwhelmed caregiver, often managing multiple children, maintaining a home without electricity or running water, and facing the crushing pressures of 19th century survival, that sudden total silence felt like nothing short of divine intervention.
It was a visible, immediate success. But to truly comprehend why parents were so desperate to silence a teething child, why they would eagerly embrace such a heavy, powerful intervention, we must look closely at the Victorian medical perspective on teething itself.
Right. Today, if you are a parent, you view teething as an incredibly frustrating, annoying, but fundamentally benign milestone.
Yeah, you might purchase a brightly colored silicone chew toy, you might massage the gums, you might administer a tiny, carefully measured dose of baby acetaminophen, and you simply endure the fussiness until the tooth erupts.
It is a rite of passage, not a crisis,
Yeah.
but the 19th century view was entirely drastically different.
How so?
The medical establishment of the era did not view teething as an annoyance. They viewed it as a profound, potentially fatal physiological crisis.
Wow.
Yes. The prevailing medical literature of the time extensively documented a condition they referred to as dental irritation. They theorized that the immense localized pressure of a tooth attempting to forcefully break through the dense tissue of the gum could cause a massive short circuit within the infant's fragile, developing nervous system.
They literally blamed teething for a staggering array of fatal conditions. If an infant developed a high fever, it was blamed on teething.
If a child suffered from severe dehydrating diarrhea likely caused by contaminated water or unpasteurized milk, it was attributed to the teeth.
If a baby suffered from violent seizures or fatal convulsions, the doctors pointed to the gums. The belief was so deeply entrenched that teething was officially listed on thousands upon thousands of death certificates as the primary cause of infant mortality.
And this terrified worldview dictated incredibly extreme interventions. If a physician genuinely believed that the pressure in a child's jaw was about to trigger a fatal systemic convulsion, they acted with brutal urgency.
Right. Doctors routinely performed a horrific procedure known as gum lancing.
They would take an unsterilized surgical blade and physically carve deep, cross-hatched incisions directly into the swollen gums of the screaming infant.
Attempting to physically cut a path for the tooth and release the supposed deadly pressure.
Imagine the sheer agony of that procedure.
And imagine the massive risk of introducing fatal bacterial infections straight into the bloodstream in an era long before anyone knew what germs were or how to wash their hands properly before surgery.
Exactly. Against the backdrop of a doctor approaching a baby with a surgical knife, a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup did not look irresponsible.
It looked profoundly humane.
It looked like the pinnacle of modern gentle medicine. Parents already expected and demanded that medicine aggressively suppress the terrifying symptoms of distress. A deeply sedated child looked like a safely treated child.
Furthermore, we cannot underestimate the sheer destructive impact of constant infant crying within the specific architecture and social structure of the era.
Right, we are not talking about modern, insulated suburban homes. The massive population booms of the Industrial Revolution had forced millions of families into dense, horrific urban living conditions.
In cities like London and New York, large families were frequently crammed into single-room tenement apartments. These rooms had incredibly poor ventilation, no soundproofing whatsoever, and were often freezing in the winter and stifling in the summer.
And in those suffocatingly tight quarters, the sound of a relentlessly screaming baby was not just an emotional drain, it was a physical threat to the family's survival.
Right. The adults in these households were subjected to grueling, unimaginably harsh labor conditions. Men and women routinely worked 12 to 14-hour shifts in dangerous textile mills, treacherous coal mines, or roaring ironworks 6 days a week.
Severe sleep deprivation in those environments meant a momentary lapse in concentration, which could easily result in a limb being crushed by an industrial loom or a fatal fall in a mine shaft.
And if the primary wage earner lost their ability to work due to an injury caused by exhaustion, the entire family faced immediate starvation and homelessness. There was no social safety net.
None. Therefore, a product that could instantly, reliably, and completely silence a screaming child solved an urgent existential social problem. It kept the fragile machinery of the working-class family functioning.
And this casual acceptance of chemical sedation was entirely supported by the broader culture of the time. Because to understand how giving morphine to a baby was normalized, you have to realize that the Victorian world was, quite literally, bathed in opiates.
Bathed in them. Modern society views narcotics with extreme caution, utilizing locked safes, federal tracking systems, and severe legal penalties. The 19th century relationship with narcotics was radically, fundamentally different.
Right.
Opium had been traded and consumed globally for centuries, but during the Victorian era, its presence permeated every single level of society.
The most common delivery method was laudanum, a potent tincture created by dissolving raw opium into high-proof alcohol.
Laudanum was essentially the aspirin of the 19th century. It was utilized for absolutely everything. It was prescribed for crippling anxiety, for menstrual cramps, for chronic diarrhea, for insomnia, for the aches and pains of hard labor, and for nagging coughs.
It was incredibly cheap, widely available, and universally accepted.
And its usage was completely democratic. Famous literary figures like Thomas de Quincey famously chronicled their heavy opium use. Aristocrats utilized it to calm their nerves in high society drawing rooms.
While exhausted laborers bought it by the pennyworth to numb the agonizing pain of their broken bodies after a shift at the docks.
While physical addiction certainly occurred on a massive scale, the formal medical understanding of addiction as a distinct physiological disease was extremely rudimentary.
Right. Many people spent their entire lives heavily dependent on laudanum without ever recognizing it as a destructive force. It was simply their daily medicine.
Exactly. And the isolation of pure morphine from raw opium in the early 1800s was actually heralded as a massive, triumphant breakthrough in medical science.
It was seen as a cleaner, more potent, more reliable advancement.
And this enthusiasm was supercharged by the invention of the hypodermic syringe in the mid-19th century. During massive conflicts like the American Civil War, injectable morphine proved incredibly, miraculously effective at managing the horrific, traumatic pain of battlefield amputations and injuries.
It saved thousands of men from dying of shock.
Because it possessed such undeniable, spectacular utility on the battlefield and in the hospital, morphine carried an aura of intense scientific respectability.
Yeah, the dangers of profound addiction, which eventually became so widespread among veterans that it was tragically referred to as the Army disease, only slowly became apparent to the medical community.
The general public's understanding of the drug's long-term devastation severely lagged behind its sheer, unregulated availability.
Right.
In a society that viewed opiates as standard, everyday tools for managing physical and emotional distress, extending that same chemical comfort to children did not seem like a radical or abusive leap.
It was standard practice. Infants and toddlers were routinely dosed with opiate-based cough syrups to stop their hacking, paregoric mixtures to halt their diarrhea, and soothing drops to force them to sleep.
The crucial boundary between legitimate medical treatment and simple, blunt force chemical sedation was constantly, hopelessly blurred.
And because there was absolutely no federal oversight, no Food and Drug Administration, no required standardization, the potency of these remedies was a complete gamble. Just imagine, substances that today are locked in pharmacy safes and highly regulated were, back then, treated with the same casualness as a cup of chamomile tea.
It's wild. A well-meaning parent might administer 3 or 4 spoonfuls of a highly concentrated opiate mixture throughout a difficult night, completely unaware of the massive cumulative dose they were delivering into their child's tiny body.
In many households, bottles of laudanum and soothing syrup sat openly on the kitchen shelves, right next to the baking flour, the sugar, and the salt. It was simply the way the world worked.
But Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup did not achieve its specific, monumental dominance over the market through chemistry alone.
No, it achieved it through an absolute masterclass in commercial persuasion. The company behind Mrs. Winslow's pioneered the art of emotional advertising long before the concept of modern pharmaceutical branding even existed.
They understood that you do not sell the chemical, you sell the outcome.
Exactly. Their sprawling advertising campaigns rarely, if ever, mention the actual physical ingredients contained within the bottle. To do so would invite unnecessary clinical scrutiny.
Instead, their copy focused with laser precision on the emotional desires of their target audience. They sold the dream of domestic perfection.
They sold the image of a beautifully rested, perfectly serene mother. They sold the vision of a quiet, orderly, deeply respectable home.
Right. The language utilized in their pamphlets and newspaper placements constantly emphasized maternal trust, generational wisdom, and familial harmony.
They would aggressively reassure mothers, printing bold claims that the syrup had been safely and successfully utilized by millions of mothers for decades, crafting an illusion of immense historical safety.
But they also played a brilliant dual strategy. On one hand, they invoked the ancient comforting wisdom of the grandmother figure. On the other hand, they framed restless, crying infants as a specific mechanical problem that modern, cutting-edge science could now neatly and efficiently solve.
They offered the best of both worlds, traditional safety and modern efficacy. And the visual imagery accompanying these promises was critical.
The Victorian era was witnessing a profound shift, increasingly blending raw commercialism with deep emotional and moral aspirations.
So when a mother purchased a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's, she was not merely buying a dark liquid in a vial. She was purchasing a tangible piece of the Victorian ideal.
She was buying into a system of middle-class respectability where children were seen and not heard, where the home was a sanctuary of peace, and where health was actively managed through wise consumer choices.
And the mechanism for delivering this brilliant emotional manipulation was unprecedented.
Right, because the patent medicine industry directly benefited from and heavily subsidized the explosive growth of the mass print newspaper industry.
The arrival of steam-powered rotary printing presses allowed daily newspapers to be printed by the millions and distributed nationally across vast railway networks.
Suddenly, an advertisement for a soothing syrup in New York could be read simultaneously by a farmer's wife in Ohio and a merchant in Chicago.
And the financial relationship between these two massive industries created a deeply dangerous symbiotic incentive structure. The newly expanding newspapers required massive amounts of advertising revenue to remain solvent and profitable.
And the patent medicine companies, flush with cash from their highly addictive products, became the largest, most lucrative advertisers of the entire era. They poured unimaginable fortunes into the press, purchasing full-page spreads and long-term contracts.
As a direct result of this financial dependency, the press largely abandoned its role as a public watchdog. Aggressive journalistic scrutiny of the patent medicine industry was practically non-existent for decades.
The newspapers were not going to bite the hand that fed them so lavishly. The manufacturers effectively purchased the silence of the press, ensuring that their beautiful, emotionally manipulative narratives went completely unchallenged by investigative reporting.
Yet, despite the massive advertising budgets and the complicit silence of the newspapers, the dark reality of the product could not remain hidden forever. The illusion inevitably began to fracture.
It did. Decades before the federal government finally intervened, deeply concerned voices within the medical community began to sound the alarm.
The pushback started quietly, in the pages of specialized medical journals. Observant, scientifically minded physicians began to notice terrifying patterns.
They argued vehemently that these heavy opiate-laden syrups did absolutely nothing to cure the underlying diseases afflicting children.
Right. They warned that the drugs merely masked the vital symptoms, creating a highly dangerous illusion of health, while the actual illness, whether it was pneumonia, dysentery, or infection, continued to ravage the child's body unchecked beneath the veil of sedation.
But other doctors saw an even more direct, immediate threat. Case reports began trickling into the medical literature detailing severe, acute overdoses.
Physicians described arriving at homes to find infants suffering from massive respiratory suppression, their skin cold and cyanotic, their breathing nearly stopped, entirely unresponsive after being dosed with the soothing syrups.
They began to document unexplained sudden infant deaths that strongly correlated with the heavy usage of these patent preparations.
The outrage among these frontline physicians grew intensely. They viewed the widespread distribution of these unregulated narcotics as a profound moral failing of society.
They argued that utilizing heavy opiates to simply silence a crying baby was not a form of medical treatment. It was a brutal form of chemical restraint.
It was a straitjacket packaged in a beautiful bottle. The anger became so palpable that some crusading physicians and medical reformers began publicly referring to soothing syrups and similar narcotic mixtures by a new, chilling moniker. They called them baby killers.
The label baby killers was a shocking, provocative indictment. It reflected a terrifying, growing awareness among medical professionals that the famous, highly prized calm achieved by these products was not a byproduct of healing, but a direct result of blunt force, life-threatening narcotic sedation.
The syrup was not curing the children. It was actively suppressing their vital functions to the absolute brink of death. Yet, despite these increasingly desperate warnings from physicians, the general public's trust in Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup remained incredibly stubbornly strong for a surprisingly long period.
It did, and to understand why parents ignored the doctors and continued to buy the syrup, we have to look at the immediate, visible evidence available to the consumer.
The successful outcomes of the syrup were highly, undeniably visible, and they occurred within minutes. An exhausted, terrified parent administered the syrup, and the screaming, inconsolable child immediately became peaceful and quiet.
The parent felt a massive, rushing wave of relief. The evidence of success was right there, sleeping softly in the cradle. You could see it, you could hear the quiet, and you could feel the tension leave the room.
But the potential harms of the product, those were incredibly insidious, diffuse, and exceptionally difficult to trace back to the source. Like, how do you isolate a poison when tragedy is already an expected guest in the nursery?
It was almost impossible. If a mother gave her infant a heavy dose of morphine syrup, the child's breathing would slow, and their immune system could become severely suppressed. Because their cough reflex was chemically blunted, fluid might begin to pool in their lungs.
And several days later, that child might develop a severe case of pneumonia and tragically pass away.
Right. And in the grief-stricken aftermath, very few parents, and indeed very few local doctors, would ever connect a death from pneumonia back to a spoonful of soothing syrup administered a week prior.
The chain of causality was too long, too obscured by the myriad of other dangers present in the Victorian world. Furthermore, the scientific tools required to prove that connection simply did not exist.
Medical record-keeping in the 19th century was wildly inconsistent, often relying on vague descriptions rather than precise diagnoses. Toxicology, the specific scientific discipline of detecting and measuring chemical poisons within human tissue, remained incredibly primitive.
If a baby died in their sleep from acute respiratory failure caused by a morphine overdose, there was no sophisticated autopsy capable of isolating the exact milligrams of narcotic in their bloodstream.
Countless opiate-induced fatalities likely passed completely unrecognized, documented merely as sudden deaths, fevers, or weakness.
And we must unflinchingly confront the devastating broader culture of the era, a culture that had deeply normalized the concept of infant mortality. Death was a constant haunting presence in the Victorian nursery.
Families entered into parenthood with the tragic, accepted understanding that a significant percentage of their children would simply not survive to see adulthood.
When death is already such a common expected visitor, it becomes incredibly difficult to isolate a specific, dangerous medicine as the definitive culprit. The high baseline of tragedy effectively camouflaged the lethal impact of the syrup.
But the societal tide was slowly, inevitably turning. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, America entered the progressive era.
This was a period defined by a surge of social activism, political reform, and a growing demand for scientific accountability. Attitudes toward the secretive, omnipotent patent medicine industry finally began to shift.
A coalition of journalists, social reformers, scientifically trained physicians, and emerging public health advocates launched a sustained, aggressive assault against the industry's dark secrecy and its blatantly deceptive, dangerous claims.
And the tipping point, the absolute catalyst for the revolution, arrived through the power of investigative journalism.
The most influential figure in this massive shift was a brilliant, relentless journalist named Samuel Hopkins Adams. In the year 1905, Adams published a landmark, explosive series of investigative articles in the highly influential Collier's Weekly magazine.
The series was dramatically titled The Great American Fraud.
It was an absolute bombshell dropped directly onto the American public. Adams did not merely criticize the industry, he meticulously, surgically dismantled it.
His articles systematically exposed the hidden, massive quantities of narcotics, the astonishingly high alcohol content, the dangerously misleading advertising tactics, and the completely fraudulent medical claims that propped up the entire patent medicine empire.
He named the companies, he exposed the formulas, he showed the tragic mathematical realities of the addiction and death they caused.
And the series stunned readers across the nation. For the first time, everyday Americans were forced to confront a horrifying truth. The trusted, beloved, beautifully packaged household remedies sitting innocently in their own kitchen cabinets were not grandmotherly cures.
They were highly potent, intensely addictive, and highly dangerous chemical cocktails, carefully hidden behind a veil of wholesome, maternal branding.
The revelation that products marketed specifically for fragile infants contained massive doses of morphine sparked profound, widespread public outrage. The illusion of safety had finally been shattered.
The immense public pressure generated by Adams' reporting, combined with the tireless lobbying of medical professionals, finally forced the hand of the United States federal government. This outrage culminated directly in the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906.
This legislation stands as one of the most vital, foundational moments in the history of modern American public health and drug regulation.
It is important to clarify, though, that the 1906 law did not immediately outlaw or ban these dangerous medicines outright. The government was not yet taking products off the shelves.
However, the law instituted a radical, unprecedented requirement. It mandated that manufacturers must accurately disclose the presence of certain dangerous active ingredients directly on the product's label.
For the first time, if a product contained morphine, cocaine, heroin, alcohol, or cannabis, it had to be explicitly printed on the bottle for the consumer to see.
Transparency itself became a revolutionary destructive act. For the entirety of its existence, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup had operated in the shadows of assumed safety.
Now, consumers could pick up that familiar glass bottle, read the label, and understand exactly what they were administering to their children.
Medicines that had once been wrapped in vague, poetic promises of maternal care and domestic peace suddenly bore the stark, terrifying clinical language of potent narcotics.
Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup looked very, very different to a mother once she realized, in plain text, that the magical, instantaneous calming effect was produced straight from a heavy dose of morphine.
The reform movement gained massive, unstoppable momentum after the label requirements went into effect. Physicians, now armed with actual ingredient lists, pushed aggressively for even stronger safety standards.
Public health advocates successfully argued that corporations should absolutely not be permitted to market incredibly powerful, addictive drugs relying solely on emotional advertising and fabricated origin stories.
And the powerful newspaper industry, which had for decades depended heavily on the massive advertising revenue of the patent medicine companies. Well, as public opinion drastically shifted, defending these exposed, narcotic-laced tonics became a massive liability.
It was suddenly terrible for their own optics and subscription rates. The newspapers slowly withdrew their protection.
The patent medicine era did not vanish overnight, but its powerful, impenetrable aura of unquestioned trust began to crack wide open, exposing the predatory machinery underneath.
Concurrently, the fundamental science of medicine itself was undergoing a massive, rapid evolution. Germ theory was finally widely accepted and understood by the medical establishment. The existence of bacteria and viruses was proven.
Scientific testing methods, laboratory diagnostics, and clinical trials improved dramatically. Pediatric medicine began to evolve from a terrifying landscape of guesswork and brutal symptom management into a much more specialized, rigorous, evidence-based field.
Treatments increasingly required concrete, measurable evidence of efficacy rather than just glowing, emotionally charged testimonials printed in an almanac.
This crucial scientific shift exposed the deepest, most fundamental flaw at the very center of products like the soothing syrup. The public slowly realized that the vast majority of these patent medicines had never truly cured a single underlying disease.
They had simply brutally altered the patient's neurological perception of reality. Alcohol provided a rush of energy. Cocaine violently stimulated the nervous system. Opiates forced profound sedation.
For decades, desperate patients had routinely interpreted those immediate, striking, overwhelming chemical sensations as absolute, definitive proof that the medicine was actively fighting the disease.
Sometimes the relief was genuinely desired. If a patient is dying in agony, numbness is certainly a mercy. But the medical community and the public finally began to recognize that real relief of a symptom and the actual treatment of a disease are not always the same thing.
Right. And Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup actually managed to remain on the market for years after the 1906 law was passed, attempting to adapt to the new regulatory reality.
However, it faced vastly intensified scrutiny from doctors, regulators, and increasingly educated parents. Public confidence in the maternal myth gradually, steadily eroded as the terrifying reality of the ingredients became common knowledge.
Eventually, bowing to overwhelming pressure and changing medical standards, the morphine was removed from the formula entirely.
But by the time the narcotic was removed, the profound damage had been done, and the product had already secured its dark, infamous place in medical history.
It transitioned from a beloved household staple into one of the defining, terrifying cautionary tales of the entire unregulated patent medicine age.
Historians and epidemiologists still debate to this day exactly how many infant illnesses, how many hidden silent overdoses, and how many unexplained tragic deaths may have directly involved the administration of soothing syrups and similar heavy narcotic preparations.
Precise, definitive numbers are simply impossible to determine. The medical records from the 19th century remain too sparse, too incomplete, and heavily biased by the era's lack of toxicological understanding.
Thousands of opiate-induced fatalities likely went completely unrecognized, falsely attributed to teething, mysterious fevers, or unrelated childhood illnesses.
But what remains absolutely undeniably clear is that an enormous, highly sophisticated, intensely profitable commercial industry managed to completely normalize the heavy narcotic sedation of fragile children on a global scale.
And they achieved this horrific feat by brilliantly hiding a potent drug behind the warm, trusted language of maternal care and domestic reassurance. And millions of consumers trusted that language completely.
Now, looking back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the story of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup can feel comfortably, safely distant. We picture black and white Victorian nurseries, women in heavy corsets, sepia-tone patent medicine advertisements, and the deeply shocking, almost absurd idea of freely pouring morphine into a baby's bottle.
It feels like a completely different world, an ignorant past that we've long since conquered.
But the underlying psychological and commercial dynamics of this story remain remarkably, unsettlingly familiar to us today. We must recognize that the product thrived not because people were foolish, but because it occupied the exact timeless intersection of profound fear, physical exhaustion, sophisticated marketing, and the inherent limitations of medicine.
Parents in the 19th century wanted certainty in a terrifyingly uncertain world. The patent medicine companies provided that certainty in a bottle.
The emotional logic that drove the massive success of the syrup was simple, elegant, and deeply, profoundly human. Your child is suffering. You are completely overwhelmed. This beautifully packaged product promises it will help immediately.
That specific, powerful emotional formula has repeated itself time and time again throughout modern medical history. Sometimes the highly marketed products genuinely do work as promised. Sometimes they work only partially, masking symptoms rather than curing.
And sometimes the severe, devastating risks of a widely prescribed treatment only emerge much, much later, long after millions of desperate people have already used them.
The specific chemical controversies certainly changed their shape and terminology across different generations, but the deep emotional vulnerabilities driving our desire for a quick, painless cure remain strikingly consistent.
Fear constantly creates intense demand. Immediate relief creates fierce, unshakable brand loyalty.
And visible, highly immediate short-term benefits can so easily, so tragically overshadow the invisible, devastating long-term consequences. The saga of Mrs. Winslow's also demonstrated the extraordinary, almost terrifying persuasive power of consumer trust.
The syrup was never, ever marketed through dry, peer-reviewed scientific journals or complex technical explanations of pharmacology. It spread through the potent power of raw emotional credibility.
The image of a kindly, wise, motherly figure, the beautiful lithograph of a peaceful, sleeping child, a perfectly packaged promise of deep comfort and restored order.
Those carefully constructed emotional images carried significantly more weight with consumers than the actual dangerous chemistry sloshing around inside the glass bottle.
In many profound ways, the marketing of this Victorian syrup perfectly foreshadowed the complex modern debates we are having right now.
We are still constantly grappling with the immense power of pharmaceutical advertising, the easily manipulated nature of consumer trust, the widespread dangers of systemic overmedication, and the constantly blurred, difficult boundary between simply relieving an uncomfortable symptom and genuinely treating the root cause of an illness.
Because ultimately, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup did not become a massive global cultural phenomenon because Victorian parents were foolish, malicious, or careless with the lives of their children.
Right, it succeeded on such a massive scale because it solved a very real, very immediate, agonizing problem for desperate people.
That solution simply carried profound lethal dangers that the vast majority of consumers could not possibly see or understand.
The medicine delivered exactly what the beautiful advertisements promised in the very short term. Quiet children, desperately rested parents, and a calmer household capable of surviving another grueling day.
The longer-term fatal consequences remained entirely hidden in the shadows, obscured by an era that lacked modern toxicology, pediatric pharmacology, or any form of strict federal oversight to protect the vulnerable.
At its very core, the story of the soothing syrup represents a devastating, tragic collision between genuine, desperate human need and an entirely unregulated, fiercely opportunistic commercial medical marketplace. Parents desperately wanted relief and safety for their children.
The manufacturers desperately wanted massive, unchecked profit.
And the slow, methodical science of medicine lagged dangerously, fatally behind both of them.
Today, the mere image of a morphine-laced infant remedy feels almost surreal. It is often treated as a shocking, macabre piece of historical trivia.
But we must remember that for decades, millions of loving, well-intentioned families viewed a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's as the absolute pinnacle of responsible, modern, humane parenting. And that may be the most deeply unsettling part of this entire historical narrative.
The true terror is not merely that such a dangerously potent medicine existed. The terror is that it looked so incredibly ordinary.
It was just a trusted, familiar bottle sitting quietly on a shelf beside the wooden cradle. It was a smiling, comforting, maternal advertisement in the Sunday morning newspaper. It was a simple, sweet-tasting spoonful administered just before bed.
And it produced a deep, profound silence that an entire generation tragically, fatally mistook for safety.
If transparency was the revolution of 1906, we have to ask ourselves today, when we look inside our own medicine cabinets, what socially acceptable, beautifully marketed remedies will the parents of a century from now look back on with the exact same horror we feel toward Mrs. Winslow's?
That is a chilling thought to end on.
Until next time.
Until next time.